Hello and welcome back to another episode of Cars and Engineering. On this episode I'm going to be talking about the winter rebuild of the 1.8 20 valve turbo BJX engine. Stay tuned. Right, so first things first, once it is completely stripped down I will inspect everything. I have the actual Volkswagen manual to this engine, so I know all the specs, I know all the tolerances, I know all the figures, everything I need to know. I've got all the correct tooling, I've got all the correct measuring equipment to check this over completely. That is the first stage, inspect. The second stage is replace. Now anything that doesn't meet the standard or is out of tolerance needs replacing or machining. Now for instance, if the bore was too worn out, I'd have to go to an oversized piston, which means the bores will have to be rebored to a bigger size, and therefore obviously that's going to be more money for the reboring process. That's going to be more money because I'm going to have to buy a new set of pistons. I believe the standard pistons are 81 millimeters wide. I think you can go up to an 83 or an 83.5. I'm not entirely sure on that. There's a range of compression ratios you can buy from Cars&engineering and obviously other companies that do pistons or anything custom. Pretty much the sky's the limit with that sort of scenario. But one thing we definitely have to change in this engine are the com rods. The com rods in the 1.8 turbos are notorious for being absolutely weak as anything. A lot of people call them cheese rods or chocolate rods because that they like to go. Then they were made to do a specific job by Volkswagen, probably going up to about 200 horsepower. So when you're putting 300 horsepower, obviously this engine came with 150 horsepower from standard. When you're putting 300 horsepower for it, which is a 100% increase, which is a double in power more or less, you're obviously doubling the torque as well. The torque is what kills the com rods, which is low down as well. So obviously when you first cane it off the line or when you first boot it from the lights, that low down torque is what bends rods or sends them flying through the block, especially with these little engines because they've got a little punchy turbo. The turbo I'll be putting on this will be a little bit bigger, not too great. It's rated for about 300 horsepower. I'll put a spec list obviously up when I do the rebuild and when we get to that stage, but at the moment I'm sort of trying to keep my options open. I've seen a turbo I like, but I'm obviously going to still keep my ear to the ground to see if there's anything better. So we've gone through the pistons, we've gone through the com rods. Some of the head work we will be doing is I will be porting and polishing the head myself because it's another learning curve. I'd like to do it myself. I'm not going to go too mental. I'm going to research as much as I can into it. I've done a little bit before, but not quite to this standard. All the videos I've seen about this engine is that it can breathe a lot better with good head work and good porting, but that also applies for obviously the intake side, which is this side covered in some very nice and clean masking tape, which I put there about 6 months ago. Also the exhaust side can benefit from porting and polishing as well, and also gasket matching, which is obviously you put the gasket over and then you see where the material overlaps. You remove that material to make the air flow into the actual head and through the engine itself nice and efficiently. As I said, the exhaust side can also benefit from it as well, and even the exhaust manifold because it will help the turbo spool quicker. So there's a lot of work to be done, not to mention obviously the block needs actual sanding down, it needs repainting, all of the holes need retapping. Obviously I need all new timing kits itself. I need a new timing or a lower crank gear. I'm also going to dowel pin that on. I'll have a video on obviously all of this, or as much as I can possibly film I will get on camera for you. And obviously once you've replaced everything and got all the parts in your arsenal, your catalogue, you can obviously rebuild it. In that process obviously everything will be checked, journal tolerances, clearances, oil clearances. I'll be using plastic gauge, I'll be using micrometers, I'll be using bore gauges, I'll be using vernier calipers. It's engine building is very much a check again process. The more you check, the better it's going to be, and as long as you know what you're doing and you have the spec sheets, it should be okay. Now as I said before, I haven't rebuilt a 1.8 turbo before. I've built other engines, a simpler engine, and obviously this being a 20 valve turbo, this has 3 inlet and 2 exhaust valves per cylinder, so there's 20 valves there to obviously inspect and maybe replace. The exhaust valves on these are notorious for being burnt out or burning out probably around the 400 horsepower mark, but obviously I'm aiming for about 300 odd, but I want there to be future bulletproof there, or future sort of like, I want to plan for future upgrades. So if I ever decide to go for a bigger turbo and more power, then that headwork's already done. So I will be looking at Inconel exhaust valves. I think they're triple grooved, I'm not sure. I'll obviously have to look into that more, but as it sits, I think the intake one should be pretty okay. It's the exhaust ones I have to worry about. Obviously, once I get in there and I inspect it, I will be able to eyeball whether they're good enough or not. I believe this engine had about 130,000 miles on it when I bought it. It might have been a bit lower, I'm not sure. But if that is the case, then obviously everything needs checking, everything needs replacing, or to the best of my abilities, everything will be replaced. Things like obviously water pump needs replacing without a question, tensioners, things like that. Obviously this cam pulley, that's okay to put back on. I doubt I'll be taking it off, to be fair, but checking the valves maybe. But there's things that you obviously have to replace. There's things that you can get away with, like knock sensors. They're pretty easy to get to once the engine's in the car. If they are knackered, then I can change them. I've obviously got the second engine actually in the car, or the actual original engine in the car, so anything I need to replace onto this will come off of that, including I think the wiring loom. I think the wiring loom is a bit different for the 9N3 Polo, because this came from a I believe it was a FR beefer. So it's the same engine, BJX, but I think the wiring loom was slightly different. This one doesn't have a oil level sensor in the actual sump. There's nothing there, it's blocked off. So straight away I know that's a different wiring loom. So obviously when I get to change the engine round, the old looms have to come off the old car and be put back onto the brand new, freshly built engine. Now I've mentioned before in other videos, just below this engine out of frame, you might be able to see it just here, is a second gearbox. Now I've said before that I'm going to be putting a LSD into that. It'll probably be a Quaife one. Well, it's 99% probably going to be a Quaife one. I've got one on order already from Quaife. Obviously with COVID going on, it's taken a bit of time, but that'll be part of the winter build as well. I'm not too fussed about it at the moment, because obviously I want to get the most of the money poured into the engine, get that ready to go, and get that ready to go in probably springtime next year, I hope. Maybe summer at the very latest, but obviously when that goes in, I'd like to be putting the gearbox in as well, because then it's a full basically running gear and transmission, well, a full engine and transmission rebuild and replace. So I know that's pretty much bulletproof. I've looked into the possibility of getting actual gearbox oil cooling. It's from Mocal. It's quite expensive, but I think it's worth it because these gearboxes tend to get very hot on track. Same with the engines. The engine's going to have an oil cooling system. I'm going to put the factory one back on there as well, and have an actual separate, I think it's a 19-row oil cooler on the side with a thermostat. I'm trying to cover every angle I possibly can with this engine, so that it's a reliable, track-orientated engine. Obviously you can drive on the road as well. So it'll be a bit of an all-rounder in some respect, but in other respects, I want it mainly aimed towards track. But that doesn't mean I'm going to be having a 7,000–8,000 RPM limit on the actual engine itself. I want to be quite conservative and leave it roughly around standard. So that's why I won't be changing a lot of the valve train this build. If I do another build, and obviously I'm going for crazy horsepower, like 4 or 5 horsepower, maybe later in the channel's life, then that's when I will be pulling the engine apart again, or maybe even rebuilding the actual standard engine in there now. Have this one as like a 300 horsepower one, and have a second engine on standby always for like set up for 4, maybe 500 horsepower. It depends. I don't know exactly the actual path I'm on at the moment. I know roughly I want about 300 horsepower out of this, and with the power to weight ratio that I've worked out, it should be pretty ample to put up a fight with quite a lot of stuff on track and just being an all-round fun track car. I'm going to replace all the big end bearings as well, because it goes whites apart. It makes sense. It's a wearable part. It needs to be replaced. I did think about getting some of the aluminium on this anodized, but I'm not sure yet. We'll see when we get there. But one thing I would like to do is I'm probably going to book a 30-minute taster session at Brands Hatch with the car to do a couple of laps, obviously cold and hot laps, to get a general gist of how quick the car is as standard form, just with 150 brake horsepower. Obviously I've got a few little upgrades here and there, but nothing too major. See what sort of time we get, and then obviously once this is rebuilt, once the suspension is on, once it's all set up, once it's got really good tyres and really nice wheels, and even the Porsche brakes as well, I want to see how much time I can shave off, obviously, by doing all of this work. If it's 10 seconds, it's 10 seconds. If it's a minute, it's a minute. I hardly doubt it, but I'm doing this for the fun of it, not because of the fact I want to beat Lamborghinis or Jaguars or Porsches or Ferraris or Skylines. I'm doing it because this is a personal project. I like it. It's a little fun car to drive. An engine rebuild's quite cheap in respect to other things. An engine rebuild for this is probably about 1,500 quid, 2 grand. I know obviously that people must think, oh my god, that's quite a lot of money, but for what you're getting, 300 horsepower, probably with a ceiling, probably get about 400 horsepower. It's quite a respectable amount of money to spend for what you're getting. That's what my calculations work out anyway. But before I digress anymore and before I ramble on anymore, I'd like to present you with one of the clothing lines that I've produced. I got this designed